Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Craig. Thanks for coming out. Before we get started, I have to take this opportunity to do something because it's not very often that I get to stand on a stage in front of a group of strangers. And I need a photo for my mom. So this has nothing to do with the talk, by the way. This is literally just a photo for my mom. So the guys at the back, if you could shift in a little bit. Could I get a smile from at least one person, please? Oh, you guys are beautiful. Well, some of you. Cool, thank you. Great. So, yes, I work for a company with a weird name, Boondoggle. Look it up. It has a funny definition as well. And I'm going to take this opportunity to talk to you about one of my favorite things, and it's not millennials. We'll talk about millennials because that's the promise, but I want to talk about my favorite picture in the world first. And that's my favorite picture in the world. Isn't it beautiful? Guys, how can you not appreciate this? All right, I see that there's no enthusiasm yet, so as we progress, hopefully it'll pick up. This is design thinking. Now, while Boondoggle does your standard digital marketing, Facebook and banner ads and digital strategy and all that stuff, the other thing that we're involved in is design thinking. And design thinking is a really brilliant process or methodology for solving problems. So the reason that I'm showing this to you today, because as we work through the presentation and we talk more about millennials, you'll begin to understand how this process is going to help you solve your marketing problems. And I'm going to use millennials as kind of an example of how this process works. So I'm just going to very briefly shoot through what each one of these 6 pillars is, so that you have a basic understanding. And if you want to talk a little bit about design thinking afterwards, I'll be around and you can just find me. So the very first pillar is empathize. And empathize is kind of not done very well in the marketing world at the moment. We tend to rely very heavily on stats and Google searches to kind of find out a little bit more about who our market is. And what design thinking really tells us is that empathy doesn't come from looking at numbers. It comes from having conversations with people. So it's really important that if you're going to empathize with someone, you're going to have a conversation with them. You're not going to have a conversation with them about what their favorite brand is. You're going to have a conversation with them about what their life is like. What are the challenges that they're facing? What are the jobs that they have to do? So empathy is only really valuable if you really immerse yourself in someone's life. And that could be through having a cup of coffee with them. I mean, there are just so many ways of empathizing with people. The next phase is define, and really this is, as a marketer, the scariest phase of all. Because what you're going to do is you're going to take all the things you learned from your empathy sessions, from all your conversations with people, and then you're going to look at your client's brief and you're going to go, wrong. You've got it wrong. Because that's 10 to 1 what you're going to find after your empathy sessions. So the definition phase is really defining what the problem is you're trying to solve, and 99% of the time, the brief that you've been given by the client is incorrect, and it's not really the problem that you're trying to solve. So it requires some bravery to do the definition phase. The next phase is the ideate phase, and that's the next most scary phase, I suppose, because that's taking your problem and kind of coming up with ideas on how to solve your problem, right? What makes that phase scary is that it's a collaborative phase, so you're going to be working with your client when you do that. Enjoy. Finally, or next, we move on to the prototype phase, and that's really just coming up with a quick minimum viable product or solution that you can test quickly. And that tends to, you'll see a lot of these things loop back. So your prototype phase loops right back to the empathy phase. So all those lovely people you met that you had coffee with, you're going to take your prototype back to them and say, all right, cool, we had that conversation. You told me what your problem was. Does this solve your problem? And hopefully they'll say yes. But if they say no, you're going to move all the way through until you hit that prototype phase again. And that really is kind of what the testing phase is about, is getting all those learnings and reinvesting them back into the prototype. And finally, you have the most fun phase of all, and that's the implementation phase, and that's when you get all your developers or your designers or whatever together, and you roll out the final product, and you you implement. So today, in context of millennials, we're not going to go through this entire process because we don't have an entire day. In fact, this entire process usually takes several months, and apparently I've only got half an hour. So we're going to only focus on the empathize phase today. And we're going to try and empathize with millennials. I'm looking around the room, and they do look like there are a lot of millennials here. Hands up if you're a millennial. Yes, there's a large number of millennials here. And there are some people who are trying to disguise themselves as millennials. I see who you are. All right. So what is a millennial? And of course, whenever you're trying to define something, your first stop is Wikipedia. As you can tell, I'm a lazy researcher. And Wikipedia defines millennials as people that are born from sort of the early 80s to the late 90s or the early 2000s. It's a nice definition because it means that we can give it sort of an exact statistic. It's 24% of the world's population. It's very precise. And in the South African context, it's 26.5% of South Africans. You've got to remember, and I'm going to use this phrase a lot, we are a third world country. You know, get the cringe over. We are a third world country. And so our youth population is a little bit bigger than a Western country would be. So yes, this definition gives us a nice space to work in, but unfortunately, if we're actually going to empathize and have conversations with people, it's not a very emotional definition to work with. It's not a very tactile definition to work with if you're going to have a conversation. So here is another definition coming up. There we go. And a millennial is a person that grew up and was immersed in a digital world. Does that make sense? Does anyone disagree with that definition? Good, because I don't care. A person that grew up was immersed in a digital world. That means that it's someone who is today digitally savvy, is very social and active on social media. This is your Instagrammer, your Snapchatter, your Tinder swiper, those sorts of people. Why I like this definition a little bit more than the Wikipedia definition is because I've met people in their mid-40s who fit into this definition, and I have met people in their early 20s who should be millennials who don't fit into this definition. So it's a nice way of meeting people where they're playing as opposed to saying you're a statistic. Having said that, though, we do kind of have to use this definition because all the people doing the data and pulling those stats together tend to use this definition. But just keep this in mind because generally it's the outliers where all that interesting insight lies. So in other words, your 45-year-old millennial is probably a little bit more interesting than your 23-year-old millennial, just saying. All right, so how do we describe millennials? They're narcissistic, they're lazy, they're ignorant, and not ignorant from a they don't know things point of view. They're ignorant because they just don't seem to know how life works. They're entitled, they deserve things, and they're arrogant. I got this entire set of descriptions from a conversation that I had with a CEO of a software development company. And I sat down with him and we were just talking about vision and goals and all that other gumph. And I said to him, well, tell me what your vision is. And he said, I'm going to save the world. I was like, oh, yeah, not aiming small, are we? And I said, how are you going to change the world? What are you going to do? And he said, well, I'm going to employ millennials. Really? Well, that's a good start, actually, because millennials really are struggling in the job market right now, especially within the South African context, so way to go. And he's like, yes. And then I'm going to teach them how to be human beings. That's a real conversation, and it didn't last long after that. So this is a kind of, if you ask Generation Xers, that's the group that I fall into, or baby boomers, this is sort of the description you get, and it's not a very positive description. I would warn you against having these sorts of words in mind when you're talking about anyone, never mind millennials. Because if we're going to empathize properly, you have to lose all your filters and have real conversations with people as opposed to coming in with preconceived ideas. So that's my number one warning. My next warning is beware the false insight. On the right, these are insights from a presentation I actually attended. And at first glance, they look like real insights. Millennials like socializing. They like going out. Well, now, hands up, who likes socializing and going out? Well, golly gee, I'm not a millennial, I like doing that, so the real test is if you can cross out the word millennial and put people in its place, it's not a real insight. Second insight, millennials like convenience. Yep, that's true because I'm a Generation Xer. I hate convenience. Give me the most difficult way. I like doing things the hard way. Inconvenience is my number one priority. So yes, once again, not a real insight. Millennials enjoy being validated. Yep, makes sense too. Generation Xer, I like being put down. Insult me, belittle me, invalidate me. I like that. No, not a real insight. People like socializing, people like convenience, and people enjoy being validated. So that's my second warning to you, and if you ever attend another millennials presentation, do this little test in your head as they're going through the insights. Go, is that millennials or is that just human beings? And also I encourage you to do it with this presentation because I haven't done that test on my own presentation because, as I said, I'm lazy. Moving on, I'm really going to figure out how this clicker works soon. So millennials do sound kind of awful, but they're not. So let's try and understand. The first stop that I made on the little empathy journey I took with millennials is I wanted to try and get a feel for how millennials perceive themselves. And I think that's always an important starting point whenever you're having a conversation with someone. Try to understand how they perceive themselves because that just generally gives you an idea on what their approach to the world is. Now, there are a number of ways I could have presented this to you. I could have given you vox pops and stats and all that sort of thing. But instead, I found this lovely comic, which I think very aptly describes how the world sees millennials and how millennials see themselves. This comic was drawn by a millennial, by the way. So, on the left, we see millennials as, I don't work because I'm an artist. What the truth is that most millennials are trapped in that catch-22 situation of, I can't work because I don't have experience, and I don't have experience because I can't work. So it's that endless loop that a lot of millennials are stuck in, and especially in the South African context, what tends to end up happening is that you'll find a lot of millennials are taking these unpaid internships, which are horrible. And we'll talk a little bit more about those later on. The next slide speaks to entitlement. I deserve this. But the reality is that most millennials just want to earn a living wage, especially in the South African context. And I keep saying that in the South African context because we are going to look at what millennials are doing internationally, and then we're going to kind of drill it down to what's happening in South Africa. So yes, and I think this speaks directly to the previous slide. If you're not making any money, you are going to be living or hoping that you can just live. Finally, and I don't know how much this applies to us, but the perception is that millennials believe they have the right to free healthcare and a right to a whole lot of other free things. And the truth is that most of them are just actually driving themselves to the hospital and self-medicating. I don't think that second picture applies to just millennials. I think a lot of us are driving ourselves to the hospital and self-medicating in today's age. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an insight into how millennials perceive themselves. I'm going to move on to my next point of departure or my next sort of step in the journey. And what I wanted to do is kind of define myself as a reference point, as a Generation Xer. I was born in 1979, by the way, so I missed millennialhood by 5 years. Define myself as a Generation Xer because the reality is that I can show you a Lamborghini and tell you how wonderful it is, but until I show you the Volkswagen Beetle, you're not going to understand how great that Lamborghini really is, right? So I'm the Volkswagen Beetle in this metaphor. I'm going to describe myself to you. So, Generation X, I was brought up with this sort of narrative. You're special. You can do anything you want. Reach for your dreams because you'll achieve them. This kind of thinking, you'll find a lot of Generation Xers had a very difficult transition point from high school into the working world, or from varsity into the working world, because the reality doesn't cater for this kind of attitude. You don't walk into the workplace on your first day of work and everyone goes, "Ah, yes, the special one has arrived. Welcome, your desk is ready." You generally walk in as nothing, and you're treated like nothing for several years after that. So that's kind of the narrative that I had growing up. Millennials have a slightly different narrative and a slightly more interesting narrative. Here you go. Your world is in economic crisis. The environment's a mess. And you've still got responsibilities to your family. So good luck with that. The millennial has a much more real narrative growing up than a Generation Xer did. And I just want to point out, though, that this real narrative kind of fits in with the world context. So in other words, if you're reading those articles on Forbes and what have you, if you've disabled the ad blocker, this is the kind of millennial attitude you're reading about. In the South African context, things are a little bit more complicated. It's a bit of a car accident of the two. So yes, here you go, your world is in crisis, the environment's a mess, and you've got all these responsibilities to your family, etc., but you're born free. You didn't have the yoke of apartheid on you, so you are special, and you can do anything you want, and you can reach for your dreams because you'll achieve them. In the interviews I've conducted with millennials, this kind of thinking creates quite a tensity with them, because they do feel responsible for making the world a better place. But there's also this feeling of, but yes, this is my time to shine as well. This is the African Renaissance, and I have to be part of that. And I am a special individual within the context of this. So there's a little bit of a tensity there, and that's quite interesting, and we'll kind of explore that a little bit later on. Right. So what is the key difference between Generation X and Millennial, Volkswagen and Lamborghini? A millennial understands that they're part of something bigger. They're part of a larger community, that their contribution to those communities are valuable, that their voice is valuable, their thoughts are valuable. They're more informed than any other generation that's come before. And this is a gift that the internet has given them. The reason that I say that there are some 45-year-old millennials is because there are people that have taken this way of thinking, this understanding on board. So it's not necessarily confined to people born in the early 80s to the late 90s. It's an attitude that can be taken on by anyone. But this is the gift that the internet has given the millennial, is that understanding that they're part of something bigger and that their contributions matter. Right. So the bad news. Narcissism is real. Arrogance is real. And laziness is indeed real. The good news is that they're no more or less lazy, arrogant, or narcissistic than any other generation that's gone before them. The big difference is that my arrogance, narcissism, and laziness has been confined to my friends and family, so I have a very small group of people that hate me, whereas millennials' arrogance, narcissism, and laziness has a mass platform like Instagram and Facebook, so they can reach a much wider audience to hate them. All right, so this generation is hyper-aware, and I'm going to take you through some stats to kind of, and sorry, this is the boring part, but here are some stats around what the third world millennial versus the Western millennial thinks. These stats are compliments of Deloitte, who have just completed their 2017 millennial survey. I encourage you to go and find it online. It's reams and reams and reams of data. I've just pulled out the ones that were most interesting for me. You might have a different take. So let's get into it. The Western millennial has a very different set of priorities from the third world millennial. The Western millennial is more concerned with the environment. They're more concerned with civic rights and civic duty. They're more concerned with equity and equality in the workplace. Whereas your third world millennial has more of an interest in crime and corruption and economy and unemployment, and really more kind of interested in the economics of the country that they're living in as opposed to the politics. And And I think that really does speak to that hyper-awareness. Whereas your Western millennials living in a more affluent area, your third world millennials living in kind of a set of countries that are struggling economically. So economics are their focus. So talking a little bit more about millennials in the workplace, your Western millennial is very, very fixated on working for a company or a brand that's making a difference, that's uplifting the community, that's doing cool things, that has a mantra I can get behind and believe in. Your third world millennial is more interested in, hey, are you guys just making money? Because I just need to get paid here. That's all that needs to happen. This is the transaction that needs to happen between us. I don't care what your beliefs are, just give me the cash. When it comes to approaching innovation, your Western millennials very much, yes, innovation is super important, and I like the fact that I am part of that innovation process. Your third world millennial, particularly your South African millennial, is in a space of, yes, innovation is important, but very often I am not given the opportunity to be part of that innovation. And that's when we start talking again about those unpaid internships that a lot of millennials find themselves trapped in just so that they can get some work experience. These people, as I said, are hyper-aware. They're switched on. They're integrated into the social networks that surround them. They've got insights that are unbelievable, and yet we delegate them to filing and answering the phone. So I think it's up to us as South Africans, especially business owners, to kind of see millennials in a different light and try to incorporate them more into brainstorming and problem solving. Finally, millennials have always been notorious or infamous for being job changers. They tend to hop around a lot. They get bored very quickly. But that's changed a little bit in the last 6 months to a year. Millennials are much more inclined to stay put now and kind of work it out at the job that they're at, and that might have something to do with political instability. I'm not going to mention any names, but he's orange and he says a lot of strange things. And especially in the African context or the third world context, people are much more wary of hopping around. So, the outtake of that is that millennials are saying to us, include me, I'm very smart, and some of them tend to be smart, and I want to direct my own future. So this, if you have that sort of filtered mindset of millennials are narcissists, this might sound like a bit of an entitled statement, but it isn't. It's really just a request. Right. Sorry, I always tend to forget what my next slide is, which is why I took, yeah. All right, there we go. So let's get into more of a South African context, I guess. I'm going to just brush over these stats. The talker or the speaker after me, Mongezi, who's pretending to be busy on his phone, will dive a little bit more deeply into these. Sorry, dude. We'll dive a little bit more deeply into these stats, so stick around if you want a more holistic view. But I just need to make a point here, so we're going to fly through this. Number one source of news, social media. Yep. Do millennials like advertising? Nope. Only 1% of millennials say that they're influenced by advertising. If you've ever run a banner campaign and seen those atrocious click-through rates, that's why. Of course, you could also do the test and say, does anyone really like advertising? So how do they make purchasing decisions? They do it with blogs and social media. And the important thing to remember is that millennials don't connect with brands as much as they connect with people. So things like influencer marketing becomes key. You'll see it, especially within the alcohol sector in this country. Alcohol brands are starting to use influencer marketing a lot more, and they carefully pick these influencers to speak to the audiences that they want to reach. So that's kind of an important box to tick whenever you're coming up with a marketing campaign for millennials. Just understand, don't do it the way Pepsi did it. 62% of millennials say that if a brand engages them in a personal fashion, they will become loyal customers. And that doesn't have to be an epic conversation. It's literally just, hey, I'm at Starbucks and you don't make the coffee I like on Facebook, and Starbucks replies and says, well, why don't you try one of our custom coffees? You can make it any way you want. Oh, that's great. I think I'll be a loyal customer going forward. So in other words, it's having a sound social media strategy. Right. I like talking about financials. I used to work in the banking sector, so 96% of millennials have a bank account. That is an amazing stat, actually, because a lot of South Africa, not the majority, but a large portion of South Africans are unbanked. So to know that the youth is 96% banked, we're making progress. 62% have bought something that was out of their budget. Granted, I pulled this off a website. I think the more real picture from the conversations that I've had with millennials is that most of them are living from paycheck to paycheck, and that something that was out of their budget was probably food. In fact, a lot of people are living from paycheck to microloan to paycheck to microloan. So it's a little bit scary at the moment. And 62% are saving for something. So all these savings months that we've had to put up with the last couple of years, they're actually paying off. People are learning that saving is important. South Africa has infamously had a poor savings culture. So we're turning that around, and that's good news. Right. So it's very easy to use the term millennial as a blanket to cover an entire group of people. But the reality is you do have to kind of subdivide them. So I've got 4 groups that I'm going to take you through. This is by no means comprehensive, so this is very top level. But I just want to help you understand that you can't ever go to someone and go, well, you're a millennial. The empathy dictates that you have to have conversations and kind of drill it down a little bit more than just a label. Right. So our biggest group is the struggling aspirational, the wannabe. So they're either formally or informally employed. They're about 40% of the millennial market, living in townships, and they use excess money for handbags and shoes. One of the things, or one of the struggles that I think we all have to deal with, but especially in the millennial world, is that we live in a world that is incredibly aware of appearance. And that's why we see so many selfies on Instagram. Those selfies on Instagram aren't narcissism run amok. It's really just attempts to fit in with the culture and to be validated. That's all it is. So this particular segment understands that, and you'll find that any excess money will be spent on fashion items, etc., etc. Right. The South African millennial, that is the welfare stater, the survivalist. 25% are just trying to get by. They have hope for a better life, despite the fact that they live off state social grants of some sort. Now, I was exposed to some interesting videos that were done internally as a research project by one of my clients, and unfortunately I can't share them with you, but they are very heartbreaking. They kind of center around millennials aged 25 to just before 30, and these guys are living still with parents or grannies. I mean, in the one interview, the guy's 25 years old, and he's saying, man, I'm going to play for Bafana Bafana one day. I'm going to get there. The one lady was, I'm going to start my fashion brand. But the reality is they don't have the means or the income or the plan to actually achieve that. So I think that this is a challenge not only from a marketing point of view, but from a societal point of view, because how do you give someone a realistic picture of what life's about without destroying their hope? And that's a very big challenge. How do you tell someone, look, buddy, you're not going to play for Bafana Bafana, let's be real, but you can still do other things and it's going to be cool. And, you know, expect that guy to wake up the next day with a smile on his face. So that's a challenge. Right. The I've arrived, 17% of the population, and they have a decent income, and they have homes and children. Those two come together apparently, and they see lifestyles as an achievement and a status symbol. So really, this is your wannabe that's gotten to where they want to be. All right, and so if you take your wannabe and your I've arrived and add it together, that's about 60% of the population. And generally, when you're running a marketing campaign, these are the people you're talking to. Right, finally, the struggling despondents, 18%. Rural millennials, and they've been dubbed as the lost generation. My God, how depressing. So, if you ever want to market to these people, you're a bad person. You're evil. Really, it's a responsibility for us as a society to figure out how we're going to uplift this group of millennials. So that kind of concludes the deep dive into the millennial is, and I hope you have a better understanding that it's a large group of subdivided people that have different circumstances. They're all fairly aware, and or in some cases hyper aware. They're switched on, connected, and plugged in. And I'm going to now move on to the promised part of the presentation, which is where we actually just talk about mobile and desktop. So there we go, mobile versus desktop. And this is a very small part of the presentation. Internationally, 20% of millennials are ditching home computers for mobile only. That really isn't much of an insight, to be honest. What's happened in the last 6 months to a year is that your tablets have become super amazingly awesome. The iPad Pro is out, Windows Surface is out, and generally tablets were seen as content consumption devices, and they've moved more into the space of content creation and content curation. So that isn't so much a mindset change within the millennial, it's more of a product change. The products have become better. In South Africa, we've always kind of been ahead of the curve, though, depending how you look at it. We've always been a mobile-first sort of economy. And so, to be honest, I was sort of handed the title of this talk. I would not have even included desktop because most South Africans relying entirely on mobile. So, I'm going to put a little star next to this bottom line because every website you read that includes stats has a different sort of how many people are online. So it's between 40 and 50% are online. I saw something yesterday that said 72% of South Africans are online. So let's just all agree it's a fairly high number and it's growing. And 80 to 90% of 16 and up South Africans own a mobile phone, right? So I'm sure most of us have seen stats like this before. Moving on to another slide, and I'm sure we've all seen this list before at some point in our lives. What are millennials doing? They're on WhatsApp, they're on Facebook, they're on Messenger, they're on Instagram, and they're on Snapchat and Twitter. Now, we could just leave it there and move on, but what's interesting is not what platforms the millennials are on, it's how they approach those platforms that makes it interesting. So I'm going to give you two examples. One of them is Instagram. As a Generation Xer, when I look at Instagram, I see a glorified photo album. I take a photo of my dog, I take a photo of my mom, I take a photo of my house. They're all separate little pictures. When a millennial looks at Instagram, they go, my God, I can tell a story. And so their day out becomes a series of 30 plus Instagram photos, and you see every detail of their trip to the beach. And that's why Instagram launched Instagram Stories. It's not just some, oh, wouldn't it be cool if we could put stories on our platform? No, it's to cater to millennials who are already telling stories using photographs. So let's give them the functionality. The next interesting example is Tinder. Now, when someone showed me Tinder, I was like, oh, right, like a dating app. Like, yeah, oh, for hooking up, that's cool. But only 20% of millennials see Tinder as a dating app. 80% see it as a confidence booster. Swipe, swipe, swipe. Oh, someone attractive likes me. By association, I am also attractive then. Swipe, swipe, swipe. Or they see it as a time waster. So in other words, I've got 10 minutes between this and that. I'm going to just Tinder and swipe to pass the time. So it's very important that when you're putting a campaign together or an approach together or a platform together, that you understand the nuances of what your target audience is doing or how they're approaching that platform. Because the platform might have a mission statement, but it will not encompass how a millennial uses that platform and how the millennial sees that platform. Right, so we're coming to the end of the talk, so I just want to give you a quick summary. Millennials are hyper-aware people. They're living in circumstances that are difficult with responsibilities that are at times overwhelming. I'm very proud of myself. I didn't use the phrase black tax once. Oh, well, okay. And to talk to a millennial requires you to be hyper-aware as well. And be authentic, know your stuff, and most of all, provide solutions to the problems that they care about. I just want to point out that be authentic part, and that's really why Pepsi's campaign fell flat, because they said, hey, millennials are civic-minded people, we'll show a massive protest march and kind of make Pepsi the star of the show. And the reality is if they were going to be authentic, they wouldn't have included a bunch of supermodels walking down the street led by one of those Kardashians. So the reason that I put up the service design or the design thinking slide up front is to kind of speak to that providing solutions. Millennials are not about gimmicks. They're not about freebies or incentives. They're about solutions. If you can come up with a application or a marketing campaign that provides a solution to a real problem that they have, you're going to hit gold. 1%, only 1% of millennials care about advertising, but 90% of millennials care about problems. 100% of millennials care about problems. So solve a problem, and you're going to get a lot of brand love. Right, so finally, if you have any questions, you can get me on Twitter. I have to warn you, I've said it about 1 million times already, I'm a Generation Xer, so good luck with that.